Hey there, weavers! Welcome back to the studio. If you're new here, my name is Nicole. I'm an artist, a weaver, a teacher, and the everything behind warp fibers. And in today's video, we're going to learn all about the warping board. Now, not only are we going to learn about what it is and when to use it, but most importantly, we're going to learn how to use it. First things first, what even is a warping board? And that's a totally fair question. A warping board is a weaving tool that you're going to use in indirect warping in order to measure out your warp to then put on your loom. And so I mentioned indirect warping because there's two different types of warping. There's indirect warping and direct warping. And I'm not going to go into the total logistics of both of those. I've got an entire blog post that I'll link in the description if you want to check that out. But the TLDR of the whole thing is that indirect warping is where you measure your warp first and then put it on your loom. And it's usually used for floor looms or table looms. And direct warping is where you're going to measure your warp and put it on the loom at the same time. And so this is usually used for a rigid heddle loom. Now, you can direct warp on a floor loom or a table loom. You just need a lot of space. And you can also indirect warp for a rigid heddle loom, and you might do this if you don't have a lot of space. It's just a lot less common. Now, as far as the warping board itself, it's basically just a big wood frame with a lot of pegs in it. You could probably make it yourself, or you can buy them already made from a lot of different stores. I'll put a link in the description below for that as well. So beyond your warping board, you're also going to need a couple of things in order to make this go smoothly. So first, yes, you're going to need a warping board, but then you're also going to need some yarn snips or some fabric scissors, as well as some yarn for your measure yarn. And I'll go over a little bit more about what that is in a second, but essentially I'm just looking for a yarn that is a completely different color than the color of the warp that I'm using, so I can easily differentiate. And then lastly, I'm also going to need some scrap yarn. And this is what I'm going to use at the end of the process to keep everything all together and to keep things from getting tangled. And I usually like to make sure that this is a different color than my warp yarn as well. And then of course, lastly, you're going to need your warp yarn. So let's go ahead and measure out our measure yarn. You might also call this a leader yarn, but essentially what it is a piece of yarn that we're going to measure out to the length of our warp. Plus a couple of inches, and then we're going to attach this to our warping board first. And what this is going to do is it's going to help us establish a pattern on our warping board and take some of the guesswork out of finding where to start and stop. And we'll just literally follow this yarn on our warping board when it's time to start measuring. And so that's why we really want it to be a completely different color from our warp yarn, because if it was the same color, it would be harder to follow, and it would be really easy to accidentally include it in our warp when we take it off of the board. So having it a different color is just a nice way to differentiate everything and make sure nothing gets confusing. So the warp that I'm doing is a 8-foot long warp, so that's going to include some loom waste, as you always should. So in order to measure this out, I'm just going to go ahead and take my tape measure and basically just start measuring. So this tape measure is only 5 feet or 60 inches, so I will have to go beyond this, but I will show you that in a minute. So I'm just pulling it out, trying not to throw my yarn on the floor. And you can get tape measures that are longer, but most of them are going to be about 5 feet long, so 60 inches, and so that's 5 feet. So we're going for 8 feet total for my specific warp. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an extra 36 inches. So I'm going to hold on to, let's see if I can, I'm going to hold on to where that 5 feet was, and I'm going to come back to the beginning of my tape measure, place it about there, and then measure out to 36, and 36 is 3 feet, so that's why we're doing that. So 5 feet plus 3 feet equals 8 feet. So all right, so that gets me to 36 right there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a couple more inches. So let's add about 4 or 5 more inches, maybe 6. Let's do 6 more inches. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us extra yarn to actually be able to tie it onto our board. Since if we had our yarn the exact length, then when we went to tie it on, we would actually lose some of that length. So giving ourselves a little bit extra just helps to make sure that our warp is the exact length. And if we add too much and our warp is like a tiny bit longer than we need it to, I'd much rather that than having it be too short. So now we're going to take our measure yarn and bring it over to our warping board, and we're going to attach it to our warping board first. And so we're going to do that with just a square knot, double knot, just really anything that is going to keep it attached to one of the pegs and make sure it doesn't come undone. So remember, this is not a part of your weaving, so this does not have to be fancy, but I would make sure not to take up too much extra yarn when you are tying it on, because we only left a little bit when we measured it out. So I'm just going to take one end of my yarn, and I'm going to tie it to my top leftmost peg. So after you get your measure yarn tied, you're first going to establish your cross. Now, the cross is incredibly important when you are warping your loom, regardless of if you're warping front to back or back to front. If you're warping from front to back, then the cross is what is going to go on your hand, and you're going to take from that and put it through your reed. If you are warping from back to front, then the cross is what's going to go on your least sticks as you warp that way. But either way, the cross is incredibly important to make sure that your warps do not get all crossed. It will keep your warping process smoother and your yarn untangled. So to establish our cross, we're going to go over the first peg, under the second peg, and then we can basically do whatever we want. So here I'm just going to find the zigzag pattern that makes the most sense to me, and I can play around with it and see what feels best. I'm going to be over here doing this repetitive motion a lot. I want it to be something that feels right. So that's too short, but if I come here, then I can do like that. Some other options, let's see. That gives me a little bit too much left over, so I think that's too short. Now that one's not long enough. Yeah, so I think I'm gonna go with the first option that I came up with, which was like this, I believe. Yes. So this is a good amount left over that I know I can still tie a knot, but it's not too much that I'm taking up from the actual warp length itself. So here at the end, just like at the beginning, I'm gonna go ahead and tie a square knot and just something to keep it nice and secure. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and push my measure yarn sort of back to make room for my warp when I am ready to put it on my board. So now we can actually put our warp on our warping board. Now I am using a linen yarn. I think it's an 8-2. I don't really remember off the top of my head. I can put it on the screen. But I'm using this yarn, and I only need 48 warp ends total. That's because I'm doing 2 very narrow weavings. This is an extra warp for my bookmarks, and so it's not very wide at all. Now, if you're doing a very wide warp, something with a lot of warp ends, like in the hundreds, I would probably recommend splitting up your warp into bundles. So doing like a bundle of 100 and 100, or like 150, 150 if you're doing 300, or 100, 100, 100, something like that. Just because I think that having smaller bundles of your warp is easier to handle, just in general. But also because if you're warping from front to back, it allows you to take breaks between slaying your reed. Since when you put your warp on your hand, you've got the cross on your hand, you're kind of stuck to the loom until you're done. So breaking it up into bundles allows you to take little breaks. It's also just easier to handle in general, easier to deal with, easier to count, so on. So usually break your warp up into smaller bundles once it gets into like the hundreds, but really just use your best judgment. So I'm just doing a 48 warp wide warp. So it's not going to be very big. I should be able to measure it out pretty quickly. But I'm going to go ahead and put my yarn on one of these. So this is a rotating yarn holder. This is not necessary, but it is kind of nice to have, especially if you're using warp on a cone, because it makes the warp just kind of come off easier. You don't really have to fight it as much. But if you don't have this, that is okay. You can put your warp in a bowl or just sitting on your floor or whatever. If your yarn is on the floor, I would recommend maybe just making sure you give it a little dust or sweep first. Otherwise, you might end up with some dust bunnies. Maybe that's just me. But I personally like to put it on a warp holder if I can. Now, you can make one of these really easily, and I'll put a link down in the description below on some information on how to do that or where to get something like this. So starting out with your warp, we're going to start the exact same way that we started our measure yarn. And so that means that I'm going to tie it to my top leftmost peg, just with a simple double knot. Alright, so once we are tied on, then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to follow our measure yarn exactly. On the way back, we're going to change it up just a little bit to create that cross, but the first time we're following it exactly. So we're going over, under, around, finding my zigzag. When I get to my very last peg, I have options, and whatever option you choose is fine, honestly. You can go under and around, or you can go over and around. You can go over and around one, and under and around on the next time. It doesn't matter, because when it comes down to it, this is going to be cut, and it all kind of works itself out. So don't fret too much if you do it differently each time, or if it looks a little messy down here, that's okay. The only thing that matters is that cross. If you have the cross, you'll be good to go. So I'm just going to come back, follow my measure yarn, and then once we get to our last 3 pegs, where our cross is, that's where we're going to do something a little bit different. Alright, so when I get to these last 3 pegs, I am also going to go over and under. So just like I did on the way down, where I went over, under, I'm going to go over, under, and that's going to create my cross. Now, as long as I do over, under each time, whether I'm going down or up, I should have a cross and be good to go. Now, when it comes to my last peg, or I guess my first peg, you are going to follow the same idea that we did with the last peg, and that's if you go over this way, you're fine. If you go over this way, you are also fine. As long as you go over this one and under this one, we are set. So you might end up having an extra cross here, depending on how you go around this peg. That's fine. I generally find that kind of messy and annoying. So I do usually personally try and go around under so that I have a nice clean area to begin with, but it doesn't matter. That's just a personal preference. So as long as you go over, under, and continue, you will be good to go. Now, if you notice as you are warping that this ends up, here, if you notice that while you are warping, that this ends up looking like this, where you've got either a warp on the top or you've got a warp on the bottom where it doesn't cross, then you do need to go back and fix that. When it comes to weaving, there are a lot of things that I will tell you that you can probably get away with not fixing or fixing later. This is not one of those things. This, you want to make sure it's doing the right thing. So I want to make sure I'm going over and then under, and we are over and under. So there are no lines on the top or bottom, we are only crossed. So now I'm just going to keep going for 48 warps total, and I usually don't count as I go. I almost always lose count when I try to do that, but feel free to try it if you would like. It's all up to you. There's no reason you can't. But so usually I will just do a bunch and then count and then hope that I didn't go over. which I don't know if that's necessarily the best option either, but we work with what we got. So I'm just gonna follow my yarn and go to 48. And one thing too that I want to point out is there are ways to kind of do this a little bit faster by always making sure you're using both hands if you can. So instead of just using, so I'm right-handed, instead of just using my right hand the whole time, like this, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with that. Instead, I usually also take my left hand and I use it to help guide around the pegs. So I'm giving myself like a larger loop to work with, just so it works a little easier, it's a little bit faster, and I feel like I'm not struggling to go around the warping board as much. And then as far as tension on the warping board, oh, see, look, I made a mistake right there. That's what happens when you talk, when you are warping. Okay, hold on 1 second, let me go back. Okay, so I want over, under. I like to go that way. Okay. So as far as tension goes, you don't want your warp to be too tight that you're putting undue stress on your yarn, but you also don't want it loose so that you have your warp hanging down, because that's going to be extra yarn that you just don't need for your project. But I am just going to follow for the rest of the board and count in a few and see where we are. All right, so I'm at 24, which happens to be exactly half of what I need. I promise I didn't rehearse that. It's just how it ended up. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to add this little piece of yarn here around these, and this is just going to be a little marker that says that this is 24 yarns, and so I don't have to count those again later. So next I just have to count to 24 again. Just because smaller numbers are easier to count to, you're less likely to mess up. So another thing to note about counting is that I counted on a flat plane of my warp. I did not count at the loop. That is really important actually, because I've had a lot of students accidentally count at the loop and they basically counted double. Because if you're counting your loops, each loop is actually 2 warps. So 1 loop, 2 warps. So I always count at a flat plane just to make sure I don't accidentally double the warp that I need. Also, I double count. I always count more than once. Even if I had exactly 48 warps and was like, all right, I'm done, I always count it at least one more time because people make mistakes. And I have, on more than one occasion, accidentally not warped the right amount and had to go back. So I always count more than once, and I always count on the flat plane. So now I'm just going to keep going to the next 24. All right, so I am at 48. I will say that once after I did that first count of this second part, I did count from there because I was at like 17, so it was pretty close, and I was confident that I was going to be able to count correctly without messing up with the last 7 warps. So I am done now with 48. So now what I have to do is I have to secure my warp to make sure that when I take it off of my warping board, it doesn't just become a big pile, and instead it becomes a nice bundle that I can transfer to my loom. So to do that, I always have leftover yarn. I always have scraps from previous projects, and I always have it like right by my warping board. And so a lot of times this will be like loom waste or things like that, just stuff that ends up not getting used. So the waste ends up not being wasted. So is what I really like to do with this. So this is an old warp that I had, and I'm gonna need a bunch of these to secure my warp. But first, what we can do is we can go ahead and cut our yarn, our tail here. Put that down. And I'm gonna take this tail and I'm going to bring it through this loop here and create a loop and a little tie. I'm gonna do that again, making sure I grab this one. Again, let's see. Loop, through the loop, just like that. And that will just kind of keep everything together at the end. If you wanted, you could do a different piece of yarn there, but this just kind of keeps that tail included as well. And then I always like to do my cross first. And that's because the cross is the most important part. So get that established first. So we're gonna take this yarn through each side of the cross so that I make sure I'm grabbing all of them in the middle. And then I'm going to bring it back through. So I'm just gonna do a little twist, bring it back through. And that's just gonna make sure everything is really secure, and then go ahead and tie a knot. Nothing, I wouldn't put it too close to this, otherwise it's gonna be hard to get out. But close enough that there's not too much wiggle room that this will move around. So that's nice and established. So I'm gonna come in with another piece of yarn on the bottom parts of my cross here. And I like to call these safety nets because they are making sure that everything is nice and secure. And so putting one here. Again, it doesn't have to be super tight. We just want to make sure that if for some reason we ever lose this, then we can still find the parts of our cross. And it'll make it a little bit easier when we are finding our cross later, when it's actually time to put it on our loom. Now I always do the bottom ones. You could do all 4. But if you're only gonna do 2, I would either do the bottom or the top. I wouldn't do like bottom and top because this is actually the exact same warp. So I'd always do bottom or top or all 4. I usually just do the bottom because I'm short and it's just easier for me to reach. So I do both of those, and then you could do these 2 if you want. Those are optional. Then I'm gonna come in and bundle the bottom together, just kind of coming through this loop. I'm just doing overhand knots, just something kind of easy, but I do want it kind of want this one tight-ish up against the warp, just so that it's really kind of pulling it together and it's not really loose. So we're gonna take a nice long piece and we're gonna fold it in half. So we've got a loop on one end and 2 tails on the other. And we're gonna bring it around our flat area. And I'm gonna try and hold this up so you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. So I'm gonna take a little bundle and I'm gonna bring the yarn that's in the back forward and the yarn that is forward back. So it is like that. And then we're gonna do a little twist. Let's see if I can do this on camera. Okay, do a little twist. It looks like this. And then we can tighten that up. We're gonna grab another little bundle. Bring that back yarn forward. Bring the forward yarn back. Twist. Same thing, a little bundle. back yarn forward, forward yarn back, twist. We can get, I think, 2 more out of this. So forward, back, twist, and that's the end. So then I can come in with a little overhand knot. And what that does is it just keeps these little sections separated. And so that will just make sure that if anything falls out of our cross, that we can just have a general idea of where it goes. So I'm gonna do that one more time for my other flat area, and then we will be ready to take it off. All right, so once you have all of your safety nets, all of your strings on your warp, keeping everything in place, if you've got any that are super long, you can go ahead and give them a little trim. But now it is time to actually take it off of the board, and this seems kind of scary, but I promise as long as you did your little yarn pieces correctly, you should be fine. Nothing's gonna fall apart. It should all stay nice and together. So what we're gonna do is we're going to go ahead and pull forward from the top where we started. And then from there, we're just going to kind of pull it off while holding the yarn. So I usually kind of take it off with both hands, and there we go. Here is our warp all measured out. All right, so if you are bringing your warp just directly over to your loom, you're ready to use it, then you're pretty much good to go. But if you are planning on transporting your warp somewhere, or if you've just got a really long warp, then I would recommend chaining your warp instead. And so you can easily take the chain out later, but it just condenses everything and makes it a little bit more portable and a little bit easier to work with. So I have my warp here, and basically chaining your warp is just like chaining in crochet. So if you already know how to crochet, then you have a leg up for this, but if you don't, it's okay because I'm gonna go over it. So I'm taking my warp, and I am finding the beginning of the warp, so where our cross is. So I can tell easily this is my cross. I've got my 3 little safety nets, and I'm gonna go ahead and find that loop that is the beginning of our warp, and I'm gonna put my hand, so in this case my dominant hand, which is right-handed, which is my right hand, I'm gonna put my right hand through my loop, and I'm going to grab from further down the warp, so from down here, and I'm going to pull it through the loop of the warp. And that creates another loop. So putting my hand through that loop, grabbing from down the warp, pulling it through to create another loop. And I'm just gonna keep going like that, grabbing and creating a new loop until I get all the way to the end. And that creates this nice condensed chain. And this will be ready to use later when I am ready to actually warp my loom. And until then, it will store nicely, and I don't really have to worry about it getting all tangled or anything like that. Learning how to use a warping board can be a really important thing for all weavers to learn how to do if they're interested in indirect warping or weaving on a floor loom or a table loom. But I also think that it happens to be kind of a fun thing to learn how to do. Is there something about establishing a pattern and then following that zigzag motion for like hundreds of warps that really kind of puts me in like a weaving mood and kind of a calm state? But I don't know, you let me know what you think in the comments. Do you prefer indirect warping versus direct warping? Have you tried out your warping board? Let me know. Now, if you found this video helpful at all, please don't forget to also like, comment, subscribe, and share. All of these fun and free things really help support the channel and help me get out weaving content to more people. And if you've got a little something extra and you want a little something extra, I also have a Patreon page. So starting at just $5 a month, you not only get to help support the channel, but you also get a lot of fun perks, including a brand new bonus weaving planner download that I made available for all levels of my patrons. So I just want to say thank you so much for watching. An extra special thank you to all of my patrons for all of your support. And until next time, happy weaving.